For 22 years, Julian Croft had managed a world. He had never once listened to it. He had arranged markets, moved capital, and built an empire of glass and steel on the assumption that what he commanded was real, and what he could not quantify was irrelevant. He had always known the price of every asset. He had never understood the nature of its value. And now, the one person who had been listening for him, the person who was the unquantifiable foundational value of it all, was gone. The realization did not arrive like a thunderclap, but like the slow, chilling discovery of a missing column in the architecture of his own life. The immediate consequence was a single phone call from a man Julian had considered a rival, but a respectable one. Eamon Hayes of the old money Hayes Bancorp, his voice devoid of its usual competitive flint, replaced by something that sounded unnervingly like pity. Julian had tried to dismiss it, to frame the absence as a temporary, personal matter. Eamon had cut through the performance with 5 quiet words. 5 words that broke something vital in the edifice of Julian Croft. She was the trust, Julian. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? The sentence landed and then hovered in the sterile air of Julian's penthouse office. She was the trust. Not that she inspired trust or facilitated it, that she was it, the raw material itself. Julian ended the call without another word, the silence that followed more damning than any accusation. He stood before the 40-foot sweep of glass that overlooked the city, a view he had curated as a testament to his own dominion. The city lights glittered below, a sprawling circuit board of human activity he had long believed he could program. Tonight, for the first time, it felt alien. It felt like it was operating on a code he had never bothered to learn. The absence he was facing was named Alara Vance. For 22 years, she had been his chief of staff, a title so inadequate it was functionally a lie. She was the firm's memory. She was its conscience. She was the silent, steady engine that turned Julian's brutal vision into a functioning and sometimes even decent reality. And she had vanished. The last time he saw her was 48 hours ago at the annual fundraising gala for the city's Contemporary Art Museum. It was the kind of event Julian loathed but mastered, a theater of performative philanthropy where the currency was not money but proximity to power. He moved through the cavernous white space of the main hall, a shark in his element, his hand shaken, his name whispered. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the cloying sweetness of ambition. He saw himself reflected in the polished marble floors, a tall, severe figure in a bespoke tuxedo, his face a mask of controlled engagement. He was playing the part of Julian Croft, the legend. He was very good at it. Alara had been there as always, a quiet presence just at the edge of his vision. She wore a simple, dark blue dress that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. She spoke to no one unless spoken to, her stillness a counterpoint to the room's frantic networking. He remembered catching her eye across the room. She was watching him, not with admiration, but with an unnerving, analytical calm. It was the look of an anthropologist observing a familiar but ultimately unknowable creature. He had felt a flicker of irritation. Why wasn't she working the room, managing the lesser donors, reinforcing the Croft and Sterling grant? He had mistaken her observation for inaction. He had mistaken her stillness for passivity. This was, he would soon learn, the central, catastrophic error of his entire professional life. He had left the gala early, a power move he often employed, leaving a vacuum in his wake. Alara, he assumed, would handle the closing pleasantries, the thank yous, the smoothing of egos he had inevitably ruffled. That was her function. He had returned to his apartment, a cavern of minimalist design high above the city, and slept the dreamless sleep of a man who believed he had absolute control. He did not notice her absence until the next morning, when his coffee was not on his desk, and the day's impossibly complex schedule was not distilled into a single, perfect sheet of paper beside it. Instead, on the polished black surface of his desk, precisely in the center, sat a small, antique brass compass. It was heavy in his hand. The needle did not point north. It was fixed, pointing stubbornly west-southwest. There was no note, no email, no text message. Her work phone, when he called, went directly to a disconnected service message. Her personal number, a number he realized with a jolt he had never personally dialed, did the same. His first reaction was not concern. It was a profound, executive-level annoyance. It was unprofessional, insubordinate. He assumed it was a negotiation tactic, a dramatic, ill-conceived gesture to demand a raise or a new title. He spent the first few hours of the day in a state of simmering rage, delegating her duties to a frantic team of junior associates who fell apart under the strain. They couldn't find the files. They didn't have the contacts. They didn't know the unwritten rules that governed every major relationship the firm had. They could execute tasks, but they could not navigate nuance. They did not have the trust. By noon, the annoyance had begun to curdle into a low, unfamiliar hum of anxiety. The firm, his magnificent, world-striding machine, was sputtering. Calls were not being returned. Meetings were being mysteriously postponed. The intricate dance of global finance he directed was faltering because the choreographer was gone. Then came the withdrawals. The first was from the Al Thani Sovereign Wealth Fund, a $9 billion commitment to their new infrastructure fund, vaporized in a single, terse email. The reason given was a reassessment of risk parameters. Julian knew this was code. He had spent weeks securing that commitment, deploying the full force of his personality and the firm's reputation. Elara had been in every meeting, silent, taking notes. He had thought she was merely documenting his triumph. The second blow landed an hour later. The Chen family office in Hong Kong, a relationship cultivated over a decade, pulled out of a co-investment in a German technology firm. Julian called Mr. Chen directly, a breach of protocol he would normally never consider. The old man was polite but firm. "Mr. Croft," he had said, his voice thin and reedy over the international line. "My family's arrangement was predicated on a certain sensibility, a continuity of understanding. That continuity is now in question." Julian didn't understand. He was the continuity. He was the firm. The third call was the one from Eamon Hayes, the one with the 5 words that cracked the foundation. After he hung up, Julian walked back to the window. The city was still there, unmoved, but his perception of it had been irrevocably altered. He was no longer looking at a kingdom. He was looking at a network of relationships he had never tended, a web of trust he had outsourced. He had been the face on the coin, but Elara had been the mint. Now he understood. This was not a negotiation. This was an abdication. She hadn't just left him. She had taken the firm's most valuable, unlisted asset with her. She had taken the trust. And he had no idea how to get it back. The compass on his desk felt heavier now, its fixed needle not a puzzle, but an indictment. It was pointing toward a truth he had spent 22 years avoiding, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the only way forward was to follow it. The morning after the withdrawals, a profound and unnerving silence settled over the 54th floor. The usual hum of quiet, relentless activity had been replaced by a tentative, anxious stillness. Julian's executive team moved with a kind of pained caution, as if the floor itself were fragile. He had spent the night in his office, a thing he hadn't done in 15 years, staring at the inert skyline and replaying every interaction with Alara he could recall from the past week, the past month, searching for a sign, a clue he had missed. But his memory was a gallery of his own performances. He remembered what he had said, the deals he had closed, the orders he had given. He could not for the life of him remember what she had done, other than be present. Her presence had been a utility, like the electricity or the internet connection. He only noticed it now that it was gone. He canceled his morning, all of it. The calls to Tokyo, the pre-brief for the quarterly review, the meeting with the architects for the new London office. He handed his phone to his junior-most assistant, a terrified young man named Peterson. "Hold everything," Julian said, his voice flat. "Tell them I am unavailable, indefinitely." The word hung in the air, an impossible concept in Julian Croft's world. He took the elevator down to the 52nd floor, to her office. It was adjacent to his own, connected by a private internal staircase, but he had used it so rarely he felt like a visitor. Her door was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was cool and smelled faintly of paper and green tea. It was a space defined by a quiet monastic order. Unlike his own office, which was a curated exhibition of power, art, awards, bespoke furniture, hers was a workshop. The walls were lined not with art, but with built-in bookshelves, filled with binders organized by year, by project, by region. A long, simple table of pale wood served as her desk, clear now except for a single, perfectly sharpened pencil lying parallel to the edge. Her chair was pushed in. The computer was off. He began a slow, methodical exploration, not of a man searching for a person, but of an analyst examining a set of data. He was trying to understand the nature of the system that had just been dismantled. He ran his hand along the spines of the binders. 2008, Global Financial Crisis. He pulled one down. The label read, Counterparty Risk Mitigation, Lehman/AIG. Inside were not just spreadsheets and legal documents, but handwritten notes, diagrams of financial contagion, lists of individuals in second and third-tier positions at other firms, people whose judgment she had apparently tracked and valued. He remembered that period as a triumph of his own aggressive deal-making, of buying distressed assets on the cheap. He saw now that beneath his predatory maneuvers, she had been building a seawall, quietly ensuring the firm's survival against the very risks he was gleefully embracing. He had been playing offense. She had been guaranteeing there was still a field to play on. He moved to her personal effects, or rather, the lack of them. The small, framed photo of a windswept coastline that had sat on her desk for years was gone. The collection of smooth, gray stones she kept in a bowl was gone. The worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations was gone. This was the detail that struck him most forcefully. It was not the act of someone fleeing in distress. It was the work of someone who had methodically packed, who had curated their own absence. It was a planned extraction. The closets were empty. The small attached bathroom, which he had never entered, was scrubbed clean, devoid of any personal trace. She had not left. She had been rendered. Julian sat down in her chair. It was a simple, ergonomic thing, chosen for function, not for status. From this vantage point, the city was still visible, but framed differently. Her window looked out not at the iconic towers he favored, but at a more complex, less glamorous view. The river, the bridges, the endless flow of traffic, the intricate, unglamorous machinery that made the city run. She had chosen a view of the process, not the monument. He looked at the empty space on her desk, where the photograph of the coast had been. He realized he had never once asked her about it. He had seen it every day for a decade and not registered it as a piece of her life. It was just part of the room's decor, an object in his world. It was in that moment, sitting in her chair, in her silence, that the full scale of his blindness became clear to him. It was not just that he had taken her for granted. It was that he had never truly seen her at all. He had seen a function, a role, an exceptionally high-performing asset. He had never seen the person. He had confused her loyalty to the firm and to the principles she quietly upheld within it for loyalty to him. He had believed she was his instrument. He was wrong. She was her own, and she had been working on a different project all along. Not the accumulation of wealth, but the preservation of integrity. And his actions, he was beginning to suspect, had finally threatened that project to a degree she could no longer mitigate. Her departure was not an attack on him. It was a defense of her life's work. His thoughts were interrupted by a call coming through on the room's landline, a phone he hadn't realized was still active. He hesitated, then answered. It was Marcus Thorne, his managing partner, his chosen successor. Marcus's voice was a study in controlled concern. Julian, are you there? I've been trying you. What in God's name is happening? The Althani pullout. It's a catastrophe. I'm managing it, Marcus, Julian said, his own voice sounding distant. Is this about Alara? Marcus pressed. Is she all right? People are spooked. They're saying she's gone. She's on a leave of absence, Julian lied, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. There was a pause. A leave of absence with no notice? The day after we lose $9 billion in funding, Marcus said slowly. Julian, you need to get ahead of this. We need to issue a statement, reassure the partners. We can frame it as a medical emergency if we have to. We need to control the narrative. Control the narrative. It was the language of his world, the language he had taught Marcus. But hearing it now, it sounded hollow, fraudulent. He was not in control of this narrative. He was a character in a story Alara was writing, and he didn't even know the plot. No statement, Marcus. Not yet, Julian said. I'm handling it. He hung up the phone. He looked again at the empty space on the desk, the ghost of a photograph of a coastline. He looked at the compass in his hand. West, southwest. He pulled out his phone, opened a map, and drew a straight line from his office building in that direction. The line crossed state borders, mountains, and finally, after thousands of miles, terminated on a rugged, sparsely populated stretch of the Pacific coast. It was a preposterous, romantic notion, a wild goose chase, and yet it was the only piece of data he had, the only clue left for him by the most meticulous person he had ever known, a person who did nothing by accident. He had spent his life dealing in certainties. For the first time, he was facing an unknown, and the only path forward was an act of faith. He had to believe the trail was real. He had to believe she had left it for him. He had to believe he was meant to follow. The first time Julian Croft met Alara Vance, he was in the process of dismantling her world. It was 2002, and Croft & Sterling was executing a hostile takeover of a mid-sized investment bank, a respectable but complacent firm that had failed to adapt to the new century's brutalities. Julian, then in his early 40s, and already a figure of mythic ambition, was personally overseeing the acquisition. He enjoyed these moments, the corporate autopsies where he could examine the weaknesses of others and affirm his own superior strength. He was walking through the bank's trading floor, a sea of defeated faces and packed cardboard boxes, a conqueror surveying his new territory. His team had assured him the bank's books were solid, its assets ripe for absorption. The due diligence was complete, a mountain of data confirming his strategic decision. But as he passed a row of cubicles, A junior analyst, a young woman who looked barely out of college, stood up and spoke. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying no fear. "There's a flaw in the sovereign debt portfolio." Julian stopped. His entourage of vice presidents and lawyers froze behind him. No one spoke to Julian Croft like that, especially not a junior employee of a company he had just broken. He turned slowly, expecting to see a flash of arrogant defiance he could enjoy crushing. Instead, he saw a young woman with dark, serious eyes and an expression of intense, impersonal focus. It was Alara. "The flaw," Julian said, his voice laced with dismissive amusement, "is that it belongs to a failing bank. We'll fix it." "No, sir," she replied, unflustered. "The flaw is structural. The Argentine bond valuations are based on a forward-looking ratings agency report that was commissioned by the issuer. It's circular. The underlying assets are worthless. It's a $40 million hole hidden behind a paid-for opinion." One of his VPs started to object, to defend their own team's analysis. Julian waved him into silence. He looked at the young woman. She wasn't pleading for her job. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was simply stating a fact, as if pointing out a mathematical error on a blackboard. There was no emotion in it, only a profound, unshakable certainty. "Show me," Julian said. She led him to her small cubicle, the only one on the floor that was not yet packed. On her screen was a complex diagram she had built herself, tracing the flow of information and capital from the Argentine government to a shell corporation in Panama, to the ratings agency, and back into the valuation model used by the bank. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting, a piece of analysis far beyond her pay grade. She had not been asked to do it. She had done it, because she had seen an anomaly and had been constitutionally incapable of ignoring it. She had paid attention. Julian listened for 10 minutes as she explained the intricate web of deceit. His own team, a dozen six-figure analysts, had missed it completely. They had looked at the official reports, the top-line numbers, and accepted them. They had seen what they were supposed to see. Alara had looked at the entire system from the ground up and seen what was actually there. When she was finished, he stood in silence for a long moment. He was not impressed by her brilliance, not in the way another man might have been. He was impressed by her utility. She was a tool, a superior instrument for detecting risk. He saw her not as a prodigy to be mentored, but as an asset to be acquired. "What's your name?" he asked. "Alara Vance." "You're packed," he said, gesturing to the boxes around them. "Unpack. You work for me now." He walked away without another word, leaving her standing in her cubicle as his team scrambled to catch up. He never asked about her career goals, her background, her life. He simply absorbed her into his organization, placing her in a newly created role in his own office. He called it Special Projects, a vague title for a function he understood only as the person who sees the things I don't. Over the years, that title evolved into Chief of Staff, but the function remained the same. She was his early warning system, his fact-checker, his institutional memory. He remembered a dinner, years later, at a restaurant in Paris. They had just closed a grueling, complex merger with a French industrial giant. Julian was celebrating, holding court with bankers and lawyers, drinking a bottle of wine that cost more than a car. Alara was at the end of the table, nursing a single glass of water, observing the scene. He had felt a magnanimous impulse, a desire to acknowledge her contribution. He raised his glass. "To Alara," he announced to the table, "who manages the details so I can paint the big picture." The table applauded politely. He had thought it was a compliment. He saw himself as the artist, the visionary, and her as the diligent, indispensable assistant who stretched his canvases and cleaned his brushes. He had looked at her then, expecting a smile of gratitude. Instead, he saw that same unnervingly calm, analytical expression she'd had on the trading floor years before. It wasn't a look of resentment. It was a look of quiet, profound disagreement. She did not see the world as a canvas for his big picture. She saw it as a complex, interconnected reality that demanded respect, a reality where the details were not subordinate to the picture, but were, in fact, the picture itself. He had dismissed the look, attributing it to her natural reserve, her lack of appetite for the spotlight. He never considered that she might simply have a different, and perhaps more accurate, view of the world. That she saw his big picture as a dangerous, egotistical abstraction, and her own work, managing the details, the people, the consequences, as the only thing that was truly real. Sitting now in her empty office, the silence a deafening roar, Julian understood the depth of that disagreement. He had built a career on the belief that will could impose itself on reality. Alara had built her career on the belief that reality, if you paid it enough attention, would tell you what was required. For 22 years, their two opposing philosophies had existed in a strange, productive symbiosis. His ambition creating the motion, her attention providing the ballast. But he had pushed too hard, demanded too much, ignored too many warnings. He had finally created a situation so antithetical to her view of the world that she could no longer provide the counterbalance. She had been forced to act. Her disappearance was not a passive withdrawal. It was the most definitive, powerful action she had ever taken. It was the logical conclusion of her 22-year argument with him, an argument he hadn't even known they were having. The compass on his desk was the first sentence of her closing statement. The first clue was the compass itself. Its needle, fixed and unmoving, pointed toward a truth beyond magnetism. Julian, acting on the hunch that had solidified into a cold certainty, booked a private jet. He did not tell anyone where he was going. He left Marcus Thorne in charge, a decision that now felt both necessary and deeply unsettling. As the jet climbed out of the eastern seaboard, he examined the compass again. It was an old military piece, likely from the Second World War, its brass casing worn smooth with time. On the back, almost invisible with age, was a tiny inscription. NYPL 476. New York Public Library. The branch on 42nd and 5th. He had flown 3,000 miles west, only to be pointed back to a location less than 2 miles from his own office. The realization was humbling. Alara was not leading him on a geographical chase. She was leading him on an intellectual one. The journey was not about distance. It was about perspective. She was forcing him to retrace his steps, to look at his own city, his own history, through a new lens. He ordered the jet to turn around. He walked into the library's main reading room the next day, feeling like a trespasser. The cavernous space, with its soaring ceilings and hushed reverence, was a world away from the frantic energy of his office. He had not been in a public library since he was a child. To him, information was a commodity, something to be acquired and weaponized, not something to be shared in a quiet, sunlit room. He found a directory and looked for room 476. It didn't exist. The room numbers didn't go that high. He felt a surge of frustration. Was this a game? A test of his patience? He was about to leave when he remembered her mind, its precision, its lack of sentimentality. NYPL 476. It wasn't a room number. He walked to the information desk, where an elderly librarian with kind, tired eyes looked up at him over her spectacles. I'm looking for information on NYPL 476, Julian said. The librarian typed into her computer. That's not a room, she said. That's an acquisition number. From the archives. It refers to a specific planning document from 1998. She looked at him with a flicker of curiosity. It's the file for the proposed demolition of the Mid-Manhattan branch for the construction of a new office tower. Julian's blood ran cold. He remembered the project. It had been one of his early, aggressive real estate plays, a chance to build a monument to himself on a prime piece of city real estate. The project had been defeated, buried in a mountain of zoning challenges and community opposition. He had been furious at the time, blaming incompetent city officials and sentimental activists. He had moved on and forgotten it. I need to see that file, he said. The librarian, whose name tag read Eleanor, led him down to the archives, a climate-controlled basement filled with the scent of old paper. She returned with a slim gray folder. This is it, she said. An interesting piece of city history. The project was all but approved, and then, at the last minute, an anonymous counterproposal was submitted. It was a brilliant piece of work. It didn't just argue for preservation. It demonstrated, with hard data, how a modest renovation of the existing library would generate more long-term economic and social value for the neighborhood than a new office tower. It was so persuasive, it swayed the entire zoning board. They never found out who wrote it. She handed him the folder. As he took it, he saw her gaze fall on the compass he was still holding in his other hand. A flicker of recognition crossed her face. That's a beautiful piece, she said. My father had one just like it. He was a navigator in the war. She looked back at Julian, her expression no longer just curious, but knowing. Alara asked me to hold this for you, she said, pulling a small, sealed manila envelope from under her desk. She said you would eventually find your way here. Julian stared at her. You know her? She volunteered here, Eleanor said simply. Every Saturday morning for the last 15 years. She taught literacy classes. She helped people write their resumes. She said it was important to listen to the stories that don't get told in boardrooms. She paused. She saved this library, Mr. Croft, and you never even knew it. The words landed without malice, a simple statement of fact that was more damning than any insult. He had been so focused on building his tower, his monument to himself, that he had been completely blind to the quiet, constructive act of preservation happening in its shadow. An act orchestrated by the woman in his own office. He took the envelope. Inside was not a letter, but a single, high-quality photograph. It was a picture of a grapevine, its ancient, gnarled trunk thick and twisted, heavy with dark purple grapes. On the back, written in Alara's precise, elegant script, were just two things: a set of coordinates and a single word. Cultivate. He knew, without having to look it up, that the coordinates would point to the Napa Valley. He also knew, with a dawning sense of dread and wonder, that this was the second stop on a journey designed to dismantle his world, piece by piece, so that he might finally see it for what it was. He had come here seeking Alara, but she was not the destination. She was the cartographer, and the map she had drawn was a map of his own ignorance. He was the territory he was being asked to explore. The flight to California was different. The first had been an act of panicked pursuit. This one was something else, something more deliberate. He spent the hours staring out the window at the shifting landscape below, the envelope from the library resting on the seat beside him. The word cultivate echoed in his mind. It was a word entirely alien to his vocabulary. He acquired, he leveraged, he divested. He did not cultivate. Cultivation implied patience, nurturing, a long-term investment in growth for its own sake. It was the antithesis of his entire philosophy, which was predicated on speed, aggression, and the extraction of immediate value. The coordinates led him to a small, unpretentious vineyard, tucked away in a lesser-known corner of Napa, far from the grand corporate wineries with their sprawling event centers and helicopter pads. The sign at the entrance was made of weathered wood, the name Serafino Vineyards carved into it by hand. As he drove up the gravel path, he saw an old man in dirt-stained jeans and a faded work shirt, his hands carefully tending to a row of vines. The man looked up as Julian's black town car, a stark intrusion in this rustic landscape, came to a stop. Julian got out, feeling overdressed and out of place in his expensive suit. The air smelled of earth and fermenting grapes. "I'm looking for the owner," Julian said. The old man wiped his hands on his pants and extended one. His grip was like stone. "You found him. I'm Angelo Serafino." His face was a roadmap of sun and time, his eyes sharp and intelligent. "My name is Julian Croft." Angelo's expression didn't change, but Julian saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition. "Croft," he said, the name sounding foreign in this setting. "I know that name." He turned and began walking toward a small stone farmhouse. "Come with me." Julian followed him into a cool, dark tasting room. Bottles of wine lined the walls. Angelo poured 2 glasses of a deep red wine without asking. He pushed one toward Julian. "Try it," he said. It was not a suggestion. Julian, who was used to $100,000 bottles and the pronouncements of world-renowned sommeliers, took a sip. It was extraordinary, rich, complex, with a finish that seemed to last for minutes. He was a man who understood value, and he knew instantly that what he was drinking was priceless, not because of its market price, but because of its integrity. "This is very good," Julian said, the praise feeling inadequate. "It's honest," Angelo corrected him. "The land tells you what it wants to be, what the grapes want to be. You can't force it. You can't rush it. You listen. You tend. You cultivate." He repeated the word from Alara's note, and Julian knew this was the lesson of this place. "You know Alara Vance," Julian stated. Angelo nodded, a slow, fond smile appearing on his face. "I do. She saved this place." He took a sip of his wine. "About 8 years ago, a big conglomerate came after us. They wanted the land for a golf resort. They tried to bury us in legal fees, bleed us dry. We were a family business for 3 generations. We were about to lose everything." Julian listened, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He had no memory of this, but it sounded like one of his firm's typical plays. "Then, one day," Angelo continued, "we get a call from a lawyer in San Francisco. He says he's been instructed by an anonymous benefactor to represent us, pro bono. He was the best. He found a loophole in an old water rights treaty from the 1920s. He tied them up in court for 2 years until they finally gave up and walked away. We never knew who it was, not for sure." He paused, looking directly at Julian. "But every year, on the anniversary of the day the conglomerate withdrew, we receive a case of our own wine sent from a distributor in New York. A 1998 Cabernet, our best year, the year my father died." It was Alara's way of telling us she was watching. She remembered. Angelo walked behind the bar and retrieved another sealed manila envelope. It was identical to the one from the library. "She called me last week, said a man named Julian Croft might come looking for this. She said you were a man who understood price but not value. She said this place might help you learn the difference." Julian took the envelope, his hand trembling slightly. He was standing in a place that existed only because of Alara's quiet, invisible intervention. She had used the profits from his world, a world of predatory acquisition, to protect this one, a world of patient cultivation. She had been running a secret, moral hedge fund against his own activities. She wasn't just his chief of staff. She was his conscience, externalized and operationalized. She believed in this, Angelo said, gesturing to the vineyard outside. She believed that some things shouldn't have a price, that their value comes from the fact that they exist at all. This land, this wine, it's my family's story. She understood that. Do you? The question was direct, simple, and utterly profound. Did he understand? He was beginning to. He was beginning to see that his entire empire, the thing he had built with such ruthless focus, was a hollow shell compared to the small, real things Alara had quietly saved. He had been building monuments. She had been preserving life. He opened the second envelope. Inside was another photograph, this one of a modern glass and steel university building. On the back, another set of coordinates, pointing this time to a university in Chicago, and another single word: principal. He looked at Angelo, whose face was impassive, a custodian who had delivered his charge. The journey was not over. The lessons were getting harder. Alara was not just showing him what she had done. She was showing him who he was, by showing him everything he was not. The third custodian was not a gentle soul like Eleanor the librarian, or a grounded patriarch like Angelo Serafino. The third custodian was a weapon. Her name was Dr. Anya Sharma, and she was the head of the Ethics and Governance program at the University of Chicago's Business School. The coordinates on the back of the photograph led Julian to her office, a minimalist space on the top floor of the building in the picture, a building his own firm had endowed a decade prior. He remembered the donation, a $10 million gesture designed to burnish the Croft and Sterling brand and create a pipeline of pliable, ambitious graduates. Dr. Sharma was a sharp, formidable woman in her late 50s, with a gaze that seemed to strip away pretense. She did not rise when Julian entered. She simply watched him approach her desk, her expression a mixture of academic curiosity and undisguised disdain. "Julian Croft," she said, her voice crisp. "I've been teaching a case study about you for 10 years. It's the capstone of my Moral Hazard in Leadership seminar. My students love it. You are the perfect archetype of ends justify the means capitalism." Julian felt a familiar surge of defensive anger, but it died before it could form. He was no longer on his home turf. He was a student in a classroom he didn't know he had enrolled in. "I'm here because of Alara Vance," he said, the words feeling like a password to a world he was only just beginning to understand. "Ah, Ilara," Dr. Sharma said, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "The anonymous grant that funds my entire department. The reason I can teach the truth about men like you without fear of reprisal from the university's donors." She leaned forward. "Did you know that? She has been funding my work, the most pointed critique of your entire industry, for a decade, with her own money. The salary you paid her. The irony is exquisite, don't you think?" Julian stood, speechless. The $10 million he had donated to the school was a public performance. Alara's contribution was a silent, structural intervention. He had paid for the building's facade. She had paid for its soul. "She was my student, you know," Dr. Sharma continued. "Years ago, before you hired her. She took a summer course with me. She was the most brilliant mind I have ever encountered. Not just intelligent, but wise. I tried to convince her to pursue an academic career. I told her going to Wall Street would destroy her." Dr. Sharma gave a dry, humorless laugh. "I was wrong. She didn't let it destroy her. She used it. She used you. She used your power, your access, your capital, as a laboratory. She stayed to see if a truly ethical person could survive inside a fundamentally unethical system. It was an experiment, a 22-year experiment. Julian felt a profound sense of vertigo. His life, his career, the narrative he had so carefully constructed was being reframed before his eyes. He was not the protagonist. He was a variable in someone else's equation. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because the experiment is over, Doctor," Sharma said, her voice losing its academic tone and becoming something harder, more urgent. "She called me. She told me the system was no longer survivable. A variable had emerged that was not just unethical, but cancerous. Something that wasn't just bending the rules, but actively trying to break the entire model for its own gain. Something she could no longer contain from the inside." Dr. Sharma reached into her desk and pulled out the third and final manila envelope. This one felt thicker, heavier. "She left this with me. She said you would arrive when you had shed enough of your certainty to be able to see what was inside. She said the first 2 stops were to teach you about value. This one is to teach you about threat." Julian took the envelope. His hands were steady now. The disorientation was being replaced by a cold, clear focus he hadn't felt in days. He was no longer just a man reckoning with his own moral failures. He was a man being handed a weapon and being told his house was on fire. "What threat?" Julian asked. Dr. Sharma looked at him, her expression grim. "The threat you cultivated, Julian, the one you mentored, the one you trusted implicitly, the one you saw as a reflection of your own best qualities. The one person, besides Alara, who had access to every secret, every pressure point, every vulnerability in your empire." She did not need to say the name. Marcus Thorne. Julian opened the envelope. It did not contain a photograph. It contained a single, black, encrypted flash drive and a small card. On the card was a 64-character alphanumeric password and a final word written in Alara's hand. The word was attention. It was the key, the theme of the entire journey. Attention was what Alara paid. It was what the librarian paid to her community, what the vintner paid to his land, what the professor paid to her principles. It was the one thing Julian had never truly paid to anyone or anything, least of all to the woman who had been trying to save him. Attention, he now understood, was not a passive act of looking. It was an active, moral engagement with the world. It was the difference between seeing and understanding. He turned to leave, the flash drive clutched in his hand. "Thank you," he said to Dr. Sharma. "Don't thank me," she replied, her voice sharp again. "I did this for her, not for you. She believes there is something in you worth salvaging. For the life of me, I can't see it. But her judgment has always been better than mine. Now go. The clock is ticking. You have spent your life building things, Mr. Croft. Now you're going to find out if you can protect one." He left the university, the professor's final words ringing in his ears. He was back in his world now, the world of threat and consequence. But he was seeing it through Alara's eyes. The flash drive in his pocket was her final lesson, a meticulously assembled archive of the betrayal that had been growing in the heart of his own kingdom, a cancer he had been utterly blind to because he had been staring at his own reflection. He did not go back to the office. He went to a secure, anonymous hotel suite he kept for emergencies, a place not even his most senior people knew existed. It was a sterile, impersonal space, perfect for the task at hand. He plugged the flash drive into a clean, air-gapped laptop. He entered the 64-character password. The word attention was not just a label, it was an instruction. The drive mounted, revealing a single, flawlessly organized folder. Inside was Alara's secret work, the product of what must have been months, if not years, of painstaking, clandestine investigation. It was a hidden archive, A shadow ledger of Marcus Thorne's treachery. Julian began to read, and as he did, the world he thought he knew dissolved. It was all there, documented with irrefutable precision. Encrypted emails, offshore bank statements, secret call logs, and sworn affidavits from junior employees Marcus had either threatened or bought. The dossier laid out a systematic, long-term plan by Marcus to dismantle Julian's control, seize the firm, and enrich himself. He saw the pattern. For the last 2 years, on every major deal Julian had led, Marcus had been running a shadow operation. He would use the firm's resources and Julian's reputation to initiate a deal, then secretly partner with a rival firm or a shell corporation he controlled, engineering a crisis that would allow his secret partners to acquire the asset at a discount, with Marcus taking a hidden percentage of the profit. He had been bleeding the firm, slowly and methodically, in a way that was almost impossible to detect from the top-line numbers. The deals still looked profitable, just not as profitable as they should have been. Julian had attributed the slight underperformance to market friction, to bad luck. He never suspected sabotage from his own chosen heir. The dossier on the Al-Thani Sovereign Wealth Fund was the most damning. It contained a recording of a call between Marcus and a cousin of the fund's director. In the call, Marcus calmly explained that Julian Croft was becoming erratic, that his judgment was failing, and that the firm was facing a leadership crisis. He advised the fund to pull its $9 billion, promising he would bring them back in at a later date under more stable management once he had taken control. He had not just anticipated the withdrawal, he had engineered it. He had used it as a weapon to sow panic and undermine Julian's authority. Julian felt a wave of nausea. He remembered Marcus's call to his office, the performance of controlled concern. "What in God's name is happening?" he had asked. He had known exactly what was happening. He had been probing, trying to gauge how much Julian knew, trying to manage the fallout of his own detonation. The most chilling part of the archive was a section labeled Project Eclipse. It was Marcus's endgame, a multi-stage plan to have Julian removed. It involved leveraging the engineered financial losses, planting fabricated stories in the financial press about Julian's declining health, and finally, using a series of anonymous complaints to trigger a regulatory investigation focused squarely on Julian himself. The evidence for the investigation, Alara's notes made clear, was being carefully manufactured by Marcus, using fragments of real transactions taken out of context to paint a picture of Julian as a reckless, senile, rogue operator. Marcus wasn't just planning a boardroom coup. He was planning to destroy Julian completely, to erase him from the company he had built. Why had Alara not just come to him with this? The answer was painfully obvious as he read on. A subfolder contained her own risk analysis of the situation. She had concluded that Marcus had embedded himself so deeply, had cultivated so many loyalties through patronage and secret deals, that a direct confrontation would be futile. Marcus would deny everything, destroy the evidence, and paint Alara as a disgruntled, hysterical employee. He would have used his influence with the board, an influence Julian had encouraged, to have her fired. Julian, in his arrogance and his blind trust in Marcus, would have likely believed him. He would have seen it as a petty power struggle, and he would have sided with the man who looked and acted just like a younger version of himself. She knew she couldn't tell him the truth. She had to make him discover it for himself. The trail she laid, the custodians, the lessons in value and principle, it wasn't just a journey of moral reckoning for Julian. It was a strategic necessity. It was the only way to strip away his biases and arrogance so that he could see the evidence for what it was. She had to deprogram him before she could arm him. He sat back, the laptop screen glowing in the dark room. The scale of her achievement was staggering. While he had been performing on the world stage, she had been fighting a silent, secret war in the trenches of his own company. She had been protecting him, not just from Marcus, but from himself. Her departure was the final, desperate move in that war. By disappearing, she created a crisis so profound that it would force him to stop, to look, to finally pay attention. She had sacrificed her own position, her own security, to give him one last chance to save himself. The final file on the drive was not evidence. It was a simple text document. It contained a single address, a small, remote cottage on the Oregon coast, the same coast from the photograph that had sat on her desk for a decade. There was no message, no invitation, just an address, a destination. He now understood. The trail was not designed to lead him to her. It was designed to lead him to the truth. The address was not a summons. It was an option. It was a quiet statement that she had done all she could. The next move was his. He could take this evidence and fight the war his way, with brutality and fire, the way he would have before. Or he could go to her, not as a boss looking for his subordinate, but as a man who had finally learned his lesson, and ask for help. He closed the laptop. For the first time in his life, Julian Croft was not sure what to do. And for the first time, he understood that this uncertainty was not a weakness, but a beginning. He had to find her. He had to ask. The house was exactly as he had imagined it from the photograph that had been a silent fixture of his life for a decade. It was a simple, cedar-shingled cottage perched on a bluff overlooking a wild, churning stretch of the Pacific Ocean. The air was cold and clean, thick with the scent of salt and pine. The constant rhythmic crash of the waves was the only sound. It was a place at the edge of the world, a place of profound and elemental peace. He had flown to Portland and driven the 2 hours to the coast alone in a rental car, a thing he hadn't done in 20 years. The process felt foreign, human-scaled. He had to navigate, to buy gas, to stop for a cup of coffee at a roadside diner. He felt like a man learning to walk again after a long illness. He saw her before she saw him. She was walking on the beach below the cottage, bundled in a thick sweater, her dark hair blowing in the wind. She was not the composed, contained figure from the office. Here, she seemed to belong to the landscape, her posture relaxed, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She looked rested. She looked free. He waited until she made her way back up the winding path to the cottage. He stood by his car, feeling like an intruder. She stopped when she saw him, her expression unreadable. There was no surprise, no anger, no relief. It was that same, unnervingly calm, observational look she had always had. The look of a scientist who has set an experiment in motion and is now waiting to see the result. "Julian," she said. Her voice was not cold, but it was not warm either. It was neutral, a statement of fact. "Alara," he replied. They stood in silence for a long moment, the sound of the ocean filling the space between them. He had rehearsed 100 speeches in his head on the drive here. Apologies, explanations, promises. They all felt hollow now, inadequate to the reality of what stood between them. "I saw it all," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "The archive, Marcus, Project Eclipse, everything." She nodded slowly. "I thought you might." "Why?" he asked, the question encompassing everything. "Why go to all that trouble? Why not just leave? Why try to save me?" She turned and looked out at the ocean. "It was never about saving you, Julian," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the sound of the waves. "It was about protecting the people who depend on the firm, the employees who do their jobs with integrity, the pension funds that invest with us, The small businesses like Angelo's that we have a chance to support. You built an empire, but you filled it with people's lives. Marcus was going to burn all of that down for his own profit. I couldn't let that happen. Her words were a quiet, devastating correction. He had thought this was a story about him, his betrayal, his redemption. He was, as always, a secondary character in a much larger narrative. It was about the principal. I built 2 response architectures, she continued, her gaze still on the water. Plan A was the one you just completed, the trail, the custodians. It was designed to see if you were capable of changing your perspective, of seeing the value beyond the price tag. If you made it here, it meant you had understood the nature of the threat, and you were ready to fight it intelligently. And Plan B? He asked. If you had ignored the compass, if you had tried to handle it with brute force, if you had fired the wrong people and promoted Marcus, I would have released a duplicate of the archive to the SEC, the Department of Justice, and the Financial Times, simultaneously. She turned to look at him now, her eyes holding his. It would have destroyed the firm, but it would have stopped Marcus. I was prepared to do it. The preservation of the principal was more important than the preservation of the institution. He absorbed the chilling logic of her words. She had been willing to sacrifice the entire company to prevent it from becoming a force for pure evil. Her loyalty was not to Croft & Sterling, the brand. It was to the idea of what Croft & Sterling could be at its best. The things you did, he said, his voice filled with a new kind of awe. The library, the vineyard, Dr. Sharma's department. You were running a parallel firm, a moral one. I was reallocating a small percentage of the profits toward ethical ballast, she said, her language as precise as ever. It was the only way I could justify the work, the only way I could stay. They stood in silence again. He saw it all now, the 22 years of their shared history, but from her perspective. He saw his own charging ambition, his blindness, his casual cruelty. And he saw her, always there, not cleaning up his messes, but mitigating them, redirecting their impact, building small pockets of good in the shadows of his destructive progress. What do we do now? He asked. It was the first time in his adult life he had ever truly asked that question of another person. He was not directing, he was inquiring. Ilara looked at him, and for the first time he saw something beyond her calm observation. It was a flicker of exhaustion, the weariness of a 22-year fight. Now, she said, we decide if we are going to rebuild what was, or if we are going to build something new. New, he said instantly, the word a vow, something new. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. All right, she said, then here is what we do. Marcus thinks he is fighting you, the Julian Croft he knows, the impulsive, aggressive, predictable man. He expects you to come back to New York and start firing people. He expects a war of attrition. We are not going to give him that. She led him into the small cottage. It was as simple and ordered as her office, but filled with a personal warmth. Books lined the walls, real books with cracked spines. The photograph from her desk was on the mantelpiece, and he realized it was a picture of this very coastline, taken from this very window. She had been carrying a piece of her escape with her all along. She sat at a simple wooden table and pulled out a small, clean notebook. Marcus has made a critical error, she said, her voice shifting, becoming the strategist he knew, but with a new authority. He believes power lies in the corner office. It doesn't. It lies in the nodes of the network, in the trust of regulators, the confidence of long-term partners, the loyalty of key personnel. He has been systematically poisoning those nodes against you, but he hasn't captured them for himself. He has only created a vacuum. She began to sketch a diagram. We don't fight him inside the firm. We fight him from the outside, using the institutions he plans to weaponize against you. We take the dossier not to the board, but to the regulatory bodies he respects. The Financial Conduct Authority in London, the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Not just the SEC, we internationalize the battlefield. He can't quietly bury a multi-jurisdictional investigation. Julian watched her mesmerized. She was not his subordinate giving him advice. She was his equal, his partner, laying out a strategy that was light years ahead of his own instincts. It was brilliant, subtle, and devastating. He will be expecting a frontal assault, she said. Instead, we will create a siege. We will call the partners he tried to spook, the Chens, the Althanis, but you will not command them. You will confess. You will tell them you were blind, that you allowed a cancer to grow, and that you are now cleaning house, with my help. You will offer them transparency. You will ask for their patience, not their loyalty. You will offer them a new kind of deal, based on proven trust, not just your signature. He saw the path she was laying out. It was not just a strategy to defeat Marcus. It was a strategy to remake the firm and to remake himself. Every step was an act of humility, an act of rebuilding trust by demonstrating it. He thinks your only weapon is power, she said, looking up from her notebook. He's wrong. Your only real weapon, the only one that matters now, is the truth. And for the first time, you are in a position to tell it. For the next 2 days, the small cottage on the Oregon coast became a war room. The transformation was startling. Julian, the man who commanded from a 40-foot wall of glass and a phalanx of assistants, now sat at a small wooden table with a single laptop and a burner phone. Ilara, the woman who had operated in the shadows, was now the clear commander, her quiet voice directing the most complex countermove of Julian's life. They worked, not as boss and employee, but as two generals pooling their expertise. Julian knew the players, their vanities, their fears. Ilara knew the system, its rules, its hidden levers of power. Their strategy was one of surgical precision, not brute force. On the first morning, Ilara directed Julian to make a series of carefully sequenced calls. The first was not to a financial partner, but to a formidable, semi-retired lawyer in Washington, D.C. named David Chen, a man known for his unimpeachable integrity and his deep connections within the Department of Justice. Julian had used him once, years ago, and had found him frustratingly principled. Tell him everything, Ilara instructed. Don't spin it, don't manage it, just tell him the truth. Tell him you were blind, that Marcus exploited your trust, and that you have irrefutable evidence of systemic fraud. Tell him you are prepared to bring it to the authorities yourself, but you want to do it in a way that protects the innocent employees and investors, not just the firm's reputation. Julian made the call. It was one of the hardest things he had ever done. He had to suppress every instinct to posture, to control the conversation. He simply laid out the facts, his voice stripped of its usual authority, replaced by a stark, unvarnished humility. He confessed his own failure of oversight. He admitted his arrogance. He listened. Chen was silent for a long time after Julian finished. I have been waiting for this phone call for 10 years, Julian, Chen said finally, his voice gravelly. Not this specific call, but one like it. The call where you finally realized the world was not your plaything. There was another pause. Send me the dossier. I will make some quiet inquiries. I will advise you on the proper channels. But Julian, if you are lying to me, or if this is another one of your games, I will personally burn you to the ground." "I understand," Julian said. And he did. The next calls were to the wavering allies, the family offices and funds Marcus had spooked. To Mr. Chen in Hong Kong, Julian did not promise returns. He apologized. "I failed to protect the integrity of my own firm," Julian said. "Alara Vance uncovered the betrayal, and she and I are now correcting it. I am not asking you to reinvest. I am asking only for your patience as I restore the honor of my house. I will call you in 1 month and present you with the audited results of our reforms. You can judge us then." To the Altani Fund, he delivered a similar message, speaking not to his usual high-level contact, but to the operational manager 2 levels down, a man Alara knew was diligent and skeptical. He was building trust from the bottom up, not commanding it from the top down. With each call, Julian felt a layer of his old self sloughing away. He was not performing humility. He was experiencing it. The power was not in the command, but in the honest admission of failure. It was terrifying and liberating. While Julian was making the calls, Alara was activating her own network. She sent encrypted portions of the dossier, carefully selected to expose Marcus without revealing their full hand, to trusted contacts inside the regulatory bodies in London and Singapore. She was seeding the ground, preparing the battlefield. She worked with a silent, focused intensity that Julian had only ever seen her apply to his problems. Now, she was applying it to theirs. On the evening of the second day, as the sun set over the Pacific, Julian's burner phone rang. It was an unknown number. He answered. It was Marcus Thorne. His voice was no longer the smooth, controlled instrument of their last call. It was tight, strained, laced with a venomous fury. "What have you done, Julian?" Marcus hissed. "I'm getting calls from London, from DC. You're trying to burn the firm down to get to me." Julian looked at Alara. She gave him a subtle nod. It was time. "It's over, Marcus," Julian said, his voice calm and even. "We know everything. Project Eclipse, the shadow deals, the Althani sabotage. We have it all." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Marcus had assumed Julian was isolated and flailing. He had never imagined a coordinated, multi-jurisdictional response. He had underestimated not just Julian's capacity to change, but Alara's capacity to strategize. But Marcus was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are predictable only in their desperation. He did the one thing they hadn't fully anticipated. He didn't try to flee. He accelerated his attack. "You think you can beat me?" Marcus spat, his voice regaining a measure of arrogant confidence. "You're a relic, Julian. An old man in a house by the sea, talking on a burner phone. I'm still here. I'm still the managing partner. And I just called an emergency meeting of the board for 48 hours from now. The vote is for your immediate removal on grounds of gross negligence and mental incompetence. Your little regulatory games will take months. I'll be in charge by Friday." He hung up. A cold dread settled in the room. Marcus had made a lateral surprise move. He wasn't trying to outrun the law. He was trying to outrun time. He was making a direct grab for institutional power, betting he could seize control of the firm before the